The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, folks. This is Josh Hallman from Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation, here with the fourth and final installment of our Vermont virtual Forest Health webinar series. And really glad that some folks could join us today. It's beautiful outside and most of my snow is gone, so hope the same is true for you and folks can get outside shortly. Thanks for joining us this morning. Again, I want to thank Kate Forer and UVM Extension for helping us out with the logistics and running the GoToWebinar. It's been really helpful to have them help us along through this process. Something that I think most people are interested in, and if you've attended these past few weeks, you've probably heard this, but we are offering credits for these from SAF, ISA, and pesticide applicator credits. And in order to get those, at the very end of the webinar, when you close out, there should be a survey that auto-populates. And if you fill that out and answer those questions, then you'll be eligible for those credits. I did hear from Ag that it's important to get your correct pesticide applicator license number in there so that they can attribute the credits to your number. So please have that available. If for some reason that survey does not pop up at the end of the presentation here, you will receive an email in the next day or two that gives you the link to that survey so that you can still fill it out. So don't panic if you don't see it immediately when closing the app. In addition, as you know, you're watching this live, but for your colleagues that might not have had the opportunity to do this today, we will be offering these as on-demand webinars for your viewing very shortly. Kind of the hope is to get this launched by Friday this week on the 15th, maybe a little bit later than that. It might be early next week, and there will be an email sent out to everybody to notify them when that is available. And when that is available, those will all be eligible for credits as well. So after the end of your viewing of the webinar, you'll be able to fill out a survey again and obtain those credits. So that's great news for everybody. Couple things about the presentation today, one being that questions for this, you probably see in the right side of your screen, there's a drop down for questions. Any questions you have throughout the presentation, please feel free to write them in there. And at the very end of the presentation, when our presenter is all done, I will collect those and ask those questions to her and get some responses for you. There should be plenty of time for questions and answers today, so feel free to come with some. I think that might be it from the logistics side of things. So today we're really lucky to have Andrea Shortsleeve from Vermont Fish and Wildlife here talking about deer browse, hunting, and foresters. And it's kind of been the history of this in-person meeting that we've had in the past. We have some wildlife talk because of the intersection, of course, of wildlife and forests. And this one seems really interesting, so I'm looking forward to hearing about this. And I hope you are too. Hope you have some good questions. But without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to Andrea and let her get going with her presentation. And yeah, thanks very much for attending. And thank you, Andrea.
All right, great. Hi. Thanks for tuning in. I know that deer browse and forest health and forest regeneration is a huge issue for everyone here in the state, and I'm just really grateful to have the opportunity to discuss this in a forest health context about what the department's doing and how the forestry community can help us spread the message about hunting and private lands and impact on forest health. So this morning I wanted to provide some background on our deer population, kind of take a look at how our department has come up with our new population objectives. And then I want to provide some talking points and tools and ideas for you to use with clients and with the public when talking about deer browse and hopefully increasing hunting. And then at the end, I'm looking forward to hopefully having a discussion with different ideas that you all have and trying to answer questions with the caveat that I am not a deer biologist and I'm not part of our big game team, but I'm happy to try to answer questions. And if I don't know the answer, I will try to point you in the direction of someone who would. So with that, we will take a look here. Our current estimate of the deer population here in Vermont is approximately 143,000 deer. Even though we give a statewide number for the population, we manage deer at a wildlife management unit scale. So there's 21 different units across the state that are broken up. They're called wildlife management units. And that's how we manage wildlife, not just deer, but a lot of our game species. And so even at these smaller unit levels, deer densities and habitat quality varies greatly within each WMU. Now, to get this overall population total, the number of deer in each wildlife management unit is estimated using a number of different population models. Our department uses 5 of them, and they incorporate data from things like roadkill deer, harvest numbers, hunter effort, things like that. So that's where we are here. This is where we're trying to go. Our department is currently working on a draft of the 2020 Big Game Plan. It's a plan that's updated every 10 years, and it identifies issues that our big game species face, talks about how to establish sustainable population and management goals, and prescribe strategies that we need to achieve these goals. It's a really important note to emphasize that our focus is not solely on the number of deer, but whether they're in balance with their habitat. And we determine that by measuring the physical condition of deer. We know that deer require a specific amount of food and cover to survive and reproduce in a successful manner. And if the quality and quantity of the food and cover isn't good, then it can lead to poor physical conditions in deer. And we can measure that through metrics like the measurement of their antlers, the weight of young deer, fawn weights, birth rates, things like that. And so, at the same time, we know that as deer compete for forage, and preferred browse species can be reduced and eliminated, just forest regeneration is negatively affected, and that's a lot of things that we hear for the forest community now. If we had consistent, reliable, and widespread browse assessments, we would also use those to help with our population objectives. We just don't have that right now. So in this version of the plan, the department's using both deer density population goals and the physical condition metrics that I just listed to keep populations at levels that are both socially acceptable and also ecologically sustainable. And so the map on the right here shows our objective deer densities per square mile for each wildlife management unit in this new draft plan. And that's accessible on our website if you'd like to take a look. And so we know that as a result of historical land use practices here in Vermont, the decline in the amount of young forest across the state, the increase of invasive plants, and also the impacts of historically overabundant deer populations in some areas really means that our forests here in the state will probably support fewer deer today than it could have in the past. And that idea is supported by the observations that we've been seeing of the deer impacts on forests and forest regeneration, and also the trends in the physical condition of the deer. So this graph here shows the average antler beam diameter, so the measure of the diameter of their antlers of yearling males over the past 8 years. It compares Vermont to our neighboring states and provinces, and it shows that we're pretty low in that group. Signifies that poor habitat conditions and poor health are most likely the result of probably never letting our deer population drop low enough to recover the habitat after having really high deer densities in previous years. So this is just one example of a physical condition that we've been looking at. We've seen that these antler beam diameters have been declining for the past 20 to 30 years. It also appears that fawn weights across the state may also be declining. So those are two just metrics that we've been looking at. Now, unfortunately, tracking the conditions of body, or tracking the changes of body condition of deer, it provides us a way to recognize when there's a need to reduce the population, but it's usually after the damage to the habitat has already occurred. So these things are showing us that we're already a little bit behind the 8 ball. And just to give you an idea of how our big game team uses all these measurements and these metrics, they put them all up for each WMU. in order to create the objectives and the recommended harvest levels. So this example here, this is a summary of the rationale for the recommendations in the WMU J1, which is in the central part of the state, the Tunbridge, Chelsea, kind of Bethel area. The yellow highlighted boxes show that the physical condition of the deer here are pretty poor. Because these metrics have been low for a few years, we presume that it relates to a historical overabundance of deer and declining habitat quality. So clearly, the deer in this unit, the deer density in this unit has exceeded the level that the habitat can support over the long run. And in order to improve both the health of the deer in the herd and also the health of the forest and the habitat in that area, the deer density must be reduced. And again, this is from a report that was presented to our Fish and Wildlife Board earlier in April, and it's accessible on our website right on the main page. So all that background is kind of just a lot of information to get to the point of saying that the recommended population objectives in our new big game plan are to either decrease or stabilize the deer population numbers in each of the WMUs across the state. So like I said earlier, there's 21 total WMUs, and 10 of them highlighted in red here on the map, we're recommending decreasing the population. And in the remaining 11, we're recommending stabilizing the population. And one thing that's important to know is that even though we're recommending a stable population in those yellow WMUs, the amount of deer harvested will need to increase in each of those WMUs just to maintain the population. And this is because we really can't rely on consistent winter kill each year to reduce the population. We're here in Vermont, we're essentially at the northern limit in the range of white-tailed deer. Their kind of strategy to survive our winters here is to basically spend the winter hunkering down and conserving energy and not moving around a lot. Historically, we've relied on winter severity and predators to keep deer species and the deer population in check. So obviously without the historic predators on the landscape to decrease or stabilize the deer populations, we have been relying on hard winters and hunters. And like I said, that's changing now. You may have heard in the news or in reports the term a winter severity index. And that's a way that we measure the severity of the winter each year and how that will impact the deer herd. And it's basically taking the number of days in the winter where we have snow over 18 inches on the ground, snow cover on the ground, and days that are below 0 degrees. And we combine that to create a winter severity index for the whole state. It gives us a number. And so in general, a winter severity index, a number of 50 can regulate a deer population, but that's not a real hard and fast rule. And you can see here on the map that between 2019 and 2020, these indexes, or the severity of each winter, really varies from year to year. So we tend to look at it over an average. Like I said, 50 is kind of a general number that we use to predict, the severity on the deer population. But if you look at the deer in the Northeast Kingdom, I mean, they basically laugh at an index of 50. And the deer in Rutland and the Champlain Valley really have trouble when the severity index gets above, 35. And that's just basically due to the animal size in the Northeast Kingdom and the functional deer wintering areas we have in those areas. So it changes throughout the state. And like I said, we look at overall trends, and looking at here the 50-year trend of winter severity, we really can't rely on that to control deer populations any longer. The blue dashed line in the graph there is the 50, the severity index 50, where we start to see a significant impact on the deer population. And you can see the trend is going well below that, and most likely that won't change into the future either. So when we talk about reducing deer numbers, we're now left to relying on hunters. And so I just wanted to list the new regulations that have been put in place for the upcoming 2020 deer season. This is our department's way of acknowledging that we need to reduce the deer population. This is how we're going to be able to do it, by increasing antlerless harvests, which is, the does and the younger bucks in the population. And it's really not just as simple as increasing the amount of antlerless permits that are available. Each year we have hundreds of them that are available, and they aren't bought and they aren't filled. So we needed to think of other strategies to increase the harvest in this way. One of the most notable ones that will hopefully have the biggest impact in the deer numbers is we've included an early muzzleloader season that will happen before the traditional rifle season. So our big game plan also identifies a lot of issues that we have while trying to, in order to try to reach our management objectives, our population goals. And even though we have the new hunting structure in place, there's still going to be quite a number of challenges to reach those goals. Things like climate change, habitat loss, the ability to collect biological data, all of those things are listed. But some of the most pertinent issues that we've identified that are relevant to our discussion today are the declining hunting numbers, the increase in suburbanization in Vermont, and just the decline in the support and really exposure to hunting for populations. And then, of course, hunter access to private land. The amount of legally posted property in Vermont has been pretty stable over the past decade. However, the highest rates of legally posted land overlap largely with areas of the highest deer densities. And when we talk about, when we only talk about legally posted land, we kind of miss the information about the amount of informally posted land, or the amount of land that was once huntable that's now lost to development. So even though the legally posted amount of land is remaining stable, there's still quite a bit of land that is no longer huntable that once was. And this has been voiced in several of our public meetings quite often by the hunting public, particularly in Franklin and Rutland counties, where we know that we have pretty dense deer numbers and impacts on our forests in those areas. So this is where I think the forestry community can help us, and really anyone that is providing any sort of technical assistance to landowners or the public. Foresters, you have a vested interest in the health of the land and health of the forest and regeneration. And you have a relationship with landowners and the public that often in the department we do not. You're seen as trusted advisors and, are used as sources of information. And so I just want to go through some talking points and identify maybe some different ways of thinking about things that can be included in your work with clients and with the public and when writing forest management plans. I think the bottom line is just that you all have an audience and can spread these messages in a way that is very different than we can at the department. And I think it'd be really helpful. So one of the first things that I think would be most beneficial in discussions with clients and with the public is just to continue to highlight the ecological impacts that high deer numbers have on the forest. I think a lot of landowners recognize that deer will impact the growth of new trees, but I've done quite a few of presentations throughout the state to the public about increasing hunter access to private land. And again, one of the comments that we get is how surprised they are at the impact that deer can have, not only on forest regeneration, but also spreading invasive species, the disappearance of spring ephemerals and rare threatened and endangered plants, and also the impact that they have on songbird habitat. So kind of emphasizing these ecological impacts, figuring out what's important to your client and important to the group that you're working with will really help spread the message that, too many deer are quite a negative thing on the landscape. We also kind of want to encourage alternatives to posting. I know that there's various reasons why landowners post the land. I get it. A lot of them are valid. I just would like to think that posting land shouldn't be the automatic default when there's other options. So, we like to talk about kind of the easiest way to ensure safety and keep a property open is using a safety zone, a 500-foot buffer around buildings with the rest of the land remaining open. This is backed by statute. These safety zone signs are free. They're available from any of our district offices. All of our wardens carry them in their trucks. Really easy to obtain. Another alternative to just flat out posting is encouraging the use of permission only signs. And so really these are used, if the primary goal is to know, for the landowner is to know who is on the property. It creates more of a welcoming feeling to hunters. It also, sets up a way for the landowner to show that they support hunting and can regulate the type of hunting that they want to happen on their property. The final sign on this slide is probably wouldn't work for every landowner that's out there, every client, but I thought it was interesting that I've worked with some people who create their own signs that they put up, and basically it's saying, yes, you're welcome here, but please follow these rules, please respect my property. And those are also an option that might work for some of your clients. We also find that a lot of landowners are really interested in learning about liability. And I think just starting that conversation with your clients will really improve kind of their comfort level of having people on their property. In Vermont, landowner liability is pretty low. And I put the statute up here, not to give you legal advice, but just to kind of serve as a reference that unless there's some real willful or negligent action on the landowner, they won't be responsible for liability. We also try to highlight that just because you're allowing public access on your property, it doesn't negate your rights as a landowner. You always have the power to address any kind of issues with damage or abuse. You can tell people where to park, where not to drive. You can request to see the hunting license or write up a contract with people on your property. It's still your property and it's still your rights. So I'd also encourage foresters to help landowners get to know their game wardens. We always refer landowners to get to know their county forester. I think it would also be a great idea to have landowners start getting to know their wardens ahead of the hunting season, and that way you can build a relationship with that where you're not hesitant to call if something looks wrong or you have an issue. We also get a lot of questions from landowners about how safe it is to have hunters on their property. And one of the best things I think that we can encourage just the general public to do is get involved in a hunter safety course. They're free, they cost nothing online or in person. Now with the virus, we have to adjust a little bit to how these courses are held, but they're still available online. They've got great information, not just about firearms and hunting safety, but also about wildlife and being outdoors. And there's also a series of additional classes that our department is holding online that covers everything from, how do you clean out a deer, how do you process it and get it ready to cook, recipes, and how to use wild game meat in your food. So really interesting things that I think, would help increase interest in allowing hunters on their property. Since 1975, anyone who holds a hunting license in Vermont has had to go through a hunter safety education course. And we've seen a significant decrease in the amount of hunting related shootings in that time. The last fatality that we've seen in a hunting season was 9 years ago. And mostly any sorts of injuries that happen in hunting, they're very rare and they're mostly minor, often self-inflicted. A hunter ends up, shooting themselves in the foot or something similar like that. In the last 30 years, we've only had 2 incidents in the state that have involved non-hunters. So I bring this up just to highlight the fact that landowners are often a little skittish about how safe it is to have people hunting on their property, and it's really kind of a misguided fear. So finally, I think we can encourage landowners to find hunters that are going to be good stewards of their property and also kind of meet the goals that we're looking for. We know that a lot of landowners will post their land and still allow 1 or 2 people, often family members, to hunt on their property. And that's great for those 1 or 2 people, but it doesn't necessarily meet the goals of what we're trying to do to reduce deer populations. So I think if we can encourage landowners to allow hunters that will be hunting out there more than just 1 weekend a year, hunt multiple seasons, the archery and muzzleloading seasons, finding hunters that will harvest does will help reach this goal of actually reducing the deer population. We also try to get the point that hunters can be very good stewards of your property. They can tell you what's going on, different corners of the woods that maybe you don't always get to, and they can also, it's a very self-regulating community. And so, I know that there are I know that not all hunters are great, but the vast majority of them are, and would like to make that reputation well known, and keep the people that aren't doing what they should be doing in check. And so finally, as foresters and people who are providing technical assistance to landowners and the public, we can be the conduit for hunters connecting with landowners. This is Vermont. Almost everyone knows someone who is a hunter and who is looking for a place to hunt. And if you can provide those connections, I think it's a lot more favorable to a landowner to have someone with a connection rather than just a stranger on their property. So, I encourage using those connections. We also have on our department website a landowner hunter website, a connection website, where landowners and hunters can register if they're looking for someone to hunt their property or looking for a property to hunt. I think it's unsurprising that we have a lot more hunters registered on this property, registered on this website than we do have landowners. So it would be great if, you do have a deer browse issue on your property that you're working on. If, you can suggest the landowner signing up for this, or, even just contacting me or someone in the department to help them with that. So in summary, we know that deer have exceeded the level that the habitat can support over the long term here in the state. And in order to improve our forest health and forest regeneration, populations need to be reduced. And the best way to achieve that objective is to increase the harvest of antlerless deer. And I hope that the forestry community and foresters can help spread this message and encourage hunting on private lands. And so with that, we can take some questions and see what kind of discussion we have.
That's great. Thanks, Andrea. That was really interesting. We do have a number of questions that came in here, and I'll start to work my way through that. It does look like Nick Fortin joined us too. So Nick, if you're there and you feel like jumping in on any of these, feel free. The first question is about Champlain Valley in Western Vermont. They have much higher numbers. The question says, I imagine that's deer numbers. Fragmentation here is higher, and so browse is more intense. So let's see, I thought that was a longer question. There's a follow-up here, but it's not really loading on my page. Let's see. Yeah, that's a little hard to answer. It's coming from Nancy Patch. I don't know if Nancy's got any more information on that. It's not really showing up well in my box here about maybe explaining why Champlain Valley and Western Vermont have higher numbers.
Why they have higher deer numbers?
Yes.
I think part of that is probably the climate. We know that it's a lot more pleasant in the Champlain Valley and in Rutland area. We have hummingbirds here now, and I know people in the Northeast Kingdom are still dealing with snow. So I think it's a much more favorable place for deer to survive over the year. Fragmentation and suburbanization have also kind of favored deer. They're an edge species that can kind of live in a lot of different general habitats, and they can thrive in these kind of fragmented suburban habitats that we're creating in Champlain Valley, without a lot of hunting pressure or predator pressure or winter kill. I think that favors an increase in the deer population in these areas.
Thanks, Andrea. I guess the other follow-up there was why the objectives are higher in that area as well.
Oh, probably because those are the areas where we are seeing some of the biggest issues with our forest regeneration. Maybe Nick can jump in on that one, but I would expect that it's probably because of the habitat issues are probably the greatest in some of those areas.
Yeah, I can add a little there. So the objectives are higher largely because, as Andrea mentioned, it's better quality deer habitat. The fragmented landscape, the abundance of agriculture supports a higher number of deer. So we have a higher objective in those areas as a result. To Nancy's original question, small blocks of forest surrounded by agriculture probably are going to see higher levels of deer impact. The forest ecosystem didn't evolve to be in a small patch, and the deer are taking advantage of the surrounding agriculture. So the deer are healthy, even if the forest isn't. It just creates a really challenging environment to try to manage when none of it's really natural.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Andrea.
No, I just said thanks, Nick, because I did not answer the question correctly.
Great, thanks to both of you there. The next question is, can you talk about the expanded archery zones? Seems these areas haven't been defined, that the rules aren't in place to allow hunters in these areas to draw additional tags yet.
Yeah, I can take that one too. So we have the rule language in place to establish expanded archery zones in they're going to generally be in sort of suburban areas. But given the potential social conflicts with sending a bunch of hunters into suburbia, we want to make sure we work with those communities before we establish any of those zones. So we have not yet established those zones. We're hoping to maybe by next year, but we want to kind of do our due diligence before we create a bunch of conflict that we don't need to create.
Great, thanks, Nick. Let's see, has there ever been a formal survey or research conducted in Vermont to determine the primary reasons that landowners post their land?
That's a good question. I know that we have looked at it. I can't give you the reasons off the top of my head. Nick, do you know?
I don't, but yeah, I know we have looked at that in the past or something close to that in the past, but yeah, I don't know what the reasons were.
I will say that we do have on our website, we have a library of survey results that from public surveys and attitudes towards hunting and things like that. And if you haven't looked through those might be a good place to start and maybe get some background information on that.
Great, thank you. Let's see here. So one of the single most important concerns of landowners is the disregard for private property rights with road damage and gate violations. Teaching more hunting ethics would be very helpful. Does the department have any plans for that?
That's a really good point that I didn't address. That, yeah, kind of some of the bad reputations that hunters get need to get fixed by the hunting community themselves. I know that our hunter ed classes address all of that. Of course, that only really gets to the new audience. I think in our series of doing public talks about hunter access, we do bring that up about being a self-regulating community and speaking up if you see hunters who aren't doing things. But that's a really good point that we can probably focus on a little bit more when we talk to the hunting community.
Great. We've got a few more questions here. I'm going to stick with some of the deer questions and then follow up with a couple other hunting related issues that don't involve deer. But the question, this comes from Chris Olson. Does Fish and Wildlife have landowner accessible information about the impact that deer have on plant communities? And is there a simple method for a landowner to build an exclosure to see if they can create an example of impacts of high deer populations?
Well, I think the simplest way would, be creating a tall fence around something. I know that is kind of cost prohibitive on large parts of land. I have seen examples where people use very large brush piles around areas of forest to keep deer out, but it's probably not something that an average landowner can do or has the space to do. And then in terms of resources, are you thinking like a handout or like a brochure or something that we can give out when we do site visits?
Great. And maybe I missed it there, Andrea. Did you answer whether or not Fish and Wildlife has information about the impact of deer on plant communities?
I don't think we have it in a real concise, like one-page document that is accessible to landowners. I know that we refer to it in both our big game plan and kind of our comprehensive deer management report, but nothing that's probably a one-pager. So we can work on that for sure.
Cool, great. Let's see here. So let's see if I can get this question right. Why not allow non-posting landowners of a certain number of acres to be allowed deer permits or to hunt regular rifle in this new pre-season muzzleloader season?
That's a Nick question.
Sure, I will take that one. Yeah, so that's definitely something that we've contemplated, and honestly, it's something I'm sure we'll contemplate more in the future. But the simple answer is, we think under our current system there is ample opportunity for landowners to harvest enough deer. We don't really feel we have enough of a need to create, cater to individual landowners that want specific types of hunting. Again, that said, I think down the road, we will probably be looking at opportunities like a deer management assistance program that many other states have for landowners that would essentially allow them, basically provide additional analyst permits to landowners that could be filled whenever they wanted. But that's down the road, and we have to sort of see where we want to see whether or not these regulation changes we just made are adequate or not first.
Great, thanks, Nick. Next one, with a higher overpopulation of deer in some of the units, is there an overabundance of deer wintering area to support many deer, and would decreasing these areas help, along with the increased hunting, to lower the populations in some specific areas to more sustainable levels?
I can take that one too.
Okay.
So the first part is no, we don't have an overabundance of deer wintering areas. Generally speaking, where we have overabundant deer are areas where we just don't have severe winters very often anymore. So, I mean, in many cases, deer rarely, if ever, use what we would traditionally consider a deer yard. But along those lines, you know, this is still Vermont. We do still get hard winters. You know, removing wintering habitat is not a good long-term management strategy. It's not something we would consider. Our department has spent, you know, decades now and you know, countless hours and money and staff time protecting deer winter habitat. It's not something we're just going to go out and eliminate, because that would affect our deer herd for decades in that area. You know, it's not a route to take.
And also, I think, you know, even though we call them deer wintering areas, there's like 90 other species that use those habitats that we would be impacting. So, you know, taking a step away from a deer focused view, there's other reasons for having those habitats on the landscape.
Great. Let's see. Has the department researched other urban bow hunting programs? Granville, Ohio is a town where this guy bow hunts, and that town has a very successful program joining bow hunters with landowners in the village limits.
Yeah, we researched a lot of those programs. We sort of the issue with those is a lot of those programs are run by the community themselves. You know, our department simply doesn't have the time to go in you know, the 6 to 8 communities we might have programs in and try to do all of this matching. If a community wanted to take the impetus to develop such a program, we would probably support it, at least in certain cases. And but our department just doesn't have the resources to kind of run a program like that.
Great, thanks, Nick. This is another question back to deer wintering areas. Someone's asking when you expect to revise some of the maps for deer wintering areas, that some of those that are currently available might be a little outdated.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, most of our deer wintering area mapping was done in the early 1980s, and it is updated periodically as we have reason to visit an area. But they are absolutely outdated in a lot of cases. I don't know if we'll ever do a massive, you know, remapping statewide. We're kind of moving toward maybe more of a remote sensing approach, you know, using available GIS data sets and kind of trying to just predict what looks like it should be deer winter habitat. You know, the reality is a lot of deer wintering areas are somewhat ephemeral. They're not functional for all that long. And so by the time we finish mapping the state, we'd already be outdated. So, you know, we're looking into maybe a more remote sensing approach that might kind of stay a little more up to date, even if it's not perfectly accurate. But that's our plan. But so I guess it's not a great answer to the question, but that's kind of where we're at right now.
Great, thanks, Nick. So a question came in about UVA and posting land. So what about not allowing landowners who are enrolled in UVA to post their land to hunting? Hunting by permission only could still be allowed to at least give the landowner a say on who or how many hunters would be using the property.
I know that's been discussed, and I know that's the model, I think, similar to New Hampshire or maybe Maine. It just hasn't really taken hold here yet. I don't know, Nick, if you've got more insight on that. I know we've discussed it, it just hasn't gone very far.
Yeah, my understanding, and this comes up all the time in our deer meetings from hunters, but my understanding is that our commissioner has tried multiple times in the legislature to get a system similar to New Hampshire's, where people in UVA that don't post get a greater rebate than people that do. That has gone absolutely nowhere in the legislature. It's something our department is very interested in. We haven't been able to get any traction on it.
Great, thanks. I'm going to go back to a couple questions that came in earlier that are not deer related but are hunting related, just so I don't lose them, and we'll see what keeps coming in there. But the first question's about bears, actually. Let's see. It says the use of telemetry versus running dogs, I presume, with and controlling the dogs has created more bad reactions from some landowners. Why are houndsmen allowed to run bear in summer when it creates more conflicts with landowners, especially those who might already have a bad view of hunting? Not sure if you guys have any expertise in the bear hunting thing, but maybe you have some thoughts.
Nick, do you have any on that?
I guess I would probably defer that question to our bear biologist.
Yeah.
I know our department supports running bears with hounds. It's a important tool for helping manage not only the bear population but conflict bears. As far as the timing and length of the training season, I'm not sure of exactly the reasoning behind that or the justification behind that, so I don't want to say something inappropriate.
Yeah, so that would be either Forrest Hammond or Jackie Camo with our department in Springfield.
Great, thanks. We had a couple questions come in about coyotes and coy dogs and the impact that they might have on controlling deer populations, and if reducing the hunting availability on coyotes or coy dogs might be a strategy in controlling some deer populations.
I think that's my favorite question. Contrary to what many people believe, and probably what most hunters would have you believe, coyotes are pretty much incapable of controlling a deer population. There can be very localized exceptions if there's a high coyote population for some reason, but on any sort of wider scale, coyotes just cannot control a deer population. They do kill a lot of deer fawns, but even in areas without predators, research tells us that half of the fawns are going to die of something. I guess the short answer is no. Reducing hunting of coyotes is not going to increase predation and somehow control the deer population.
Great, thank you. All right. One other question down here so far says, does the state use deer exclosures on any of their WMAs to understand deer population numbers, densities? If not, why not? And if so, are there metrics that are available?
I guess I can take this one too. So we do have a couple deer exposures at least in southern Vermont, on a couple WMAs. Deer exposures are really best used as a visual. It's difficult to actually collect data from a deer exposure. The important thing there is that no deer is not a natural situation either. So it's not appropriate to compare a land, in the exposure with 0 deer to whatever may be happening outside. But it is a great visual tool for landowners who may not believe they have browse problem. There are a few browse assessment programs out there being developed. New York has one called Avid that's decent. It's an app actually, so it's pretty easy for a landowner to use. There are a few others, simple techniques for assessing browse damage. The challenge is they kind of require measurement, repeatedly over time, which is hard to keep up in a lot of cases.
I know we're doing a habitat project in Heinsberg on the La Platte River that we're including fencing on our plantings, but it's not part of a research project. It's just an effort to keep our resources there.
Great, thank you both. It looks like that's it for questions so far. I'm going to leave it open for a moment here, just in case some other thoughts come in. I do also want to let folks know that there have been some comments coming through in the questions pane. So if you haven't clicked through that, maybe some things that that I didn't ask properly or that weren't addressed before might be in there and of interest to you. So take a look through there before you close out today.
And I guess one last thing, or one thing that I didn't mention during the talk is that we're still taking comments on these seasons, and if people are interested in making those comments, they can visit our website and send something in, or contact their Fish and Wildlife Board rep to make sure that their voices are being heard.
Great. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions come in. So I'm going to take this opportunity to thank Andrea for a great presentation. And thank you, Andrea and Nick, for both replying to the many questions. I think we set a record for this webinar series today with questions, so that's great. I want to remind folks that as you click out, please take that survey so that you can get credits. That would be excellent. And again, if you don't see that pop up immediately, you should expect an email in the next day or two that will allow you to do so. And expect an email coming shortly when the on-demand webinars are available and ready for credit. That should be either later this week or early next week. But thanks everybody for attending, and for anybody who made it through all 4 of the webinars, thanks for listening to all of them. We had some great speakers this time, and hopefully next year we'll be able to do the Forest Health meeting in person. But this has been a really great resource for us, and I'm really glad that we were able to make it happen. So thank you very much, and enjoy the weather out there. Have a great day.